Why do we get conflicting studies? We get studies from researchers who say cell phones aren't dangerous for you. Then we get studies that say, yes, they are.
Well, a lot of it depends on who funded the study. Like every other science, particularly where there's a large industry presence, there's a lot of spinning. But I have to tell you, when you go to a number of the scientists that we did for the Bioinitiative report, and they give you all the science, and 50% or more of those studies are reporting effects that should not be occurring at those levels. There shouldn't even be one or two, maybe a false positive or two, but we're seeing continual, consistent evidence. And, of course, the industry would have you believe that every study has to report positive effects, and you virtually have to have proof before you would take any action. But having 50% of the studies is way more evidence than public health experts say we need in order to start taking some preventative action. So, yeah, when you hear that, well, this study said yes, this study said no, what you ought to do is look at the weight of the evidence, look at all the studies, and if you have more than a handful in an environmental toxin, a chemical or non-ionizing radiation showing positive studies, then you're onto something and you ought to follow it.
Right, and definitely, as you said, you've got to be aware of who's funding the study.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Henry Lai, he was one of our authors, and he's with University of Washington School of Medicine, actually looked at a large number of studies that report on DNA effects and with genotoxicity and neurological effects or effects on the nervous system. And what he found was that if you look at all of the studies together, they fall about 50-50, 50% saying their effects and 50% not. But if you divide them up, so you look at industry-funded studies alone, a quarter of them are positive, three-quarters are negative. If you look at, on the other half of the graph, all of those studies that were independently funded, about 75% are positive, showing effect, and only 25% not. So there's a clear skew according to funding.
Well, I've got to tell you, it's widespread, it's worldwide, and how do we know how many people are getting ill and sick, and we just can't point our fingers in that direction?
Well, one of the things we've tried to do is to take the science and make it more understandable, for people who are buying devices, so they can at least be informed when they make a choice. We're doing this for decision makers who are not necessarily scientists, and what we're trying to say is, look, if you want to use a cell phone, maybe you ought to consider not wearing it or turning it off if you have to wear it. Maybe you ought to use an earpiece. At the same time, we're telling industry, if you look at the brain tumor statistics today, and if you look at the acoustic neuroma statistics today, and the costs of those, and how big of an issue this is going to be, if in fact this is a carcinogenic exposure, you guys better think about redesigning. You could go to a speakerphone-only mode. You could go to a cell phone that's designed so it doesn't even operate when you hold it to your head. You could greatly reduce these exposures. So we're trying to provide a good scientific and public health policy basis for making recommendations that might really prevent a lot of public health drama down the road and extreme cost if you look at this as a worldwide issue.
God, Cindy, what about little children who use cell phones?
A number of countries now around the world have recommended, their governments have recommended that children not use cell phones at all. And the United States has turned a deaf ear to even the conversation on the subject, let alone having health agencies here make recommendations like that. But the German government, for example, recently recommended, even down to the Wi-Fi level, that Wi-Fi not be installed in schools and in libraries where we have alternatives. For Wi-Fi, we have alternatives with wired, with Cat5 cable. So making choices requires information. And when you understand that exposure to radio frequency at levels that the government allows today in almost every country of the world is associated with increased risk of brain tumors increased risk of other cancers, and is looking as if it interferes with memory, with concentration, and with sleep. This is not the thing you want to give to your child.
No, not at all.
And you might want to think about your own health.
Well, that's true. So does every country on this planet have different values, different levels of approval for this?
Not every country. The countries in Europe and the Nordic countries, for the most part, all operate under a single set of guidelines, the ICNIRP guidelines, if you just want to use the acronym. And in the United States, we operate at something that's close but a little bit more restrictive. There are a few countries around the world, though, that are balking at this and saying, hey, we're not going to spend a lot of money on people that get brain tumors or have premature senility, because we look at these studies and see that the evidence is persuasive enough to drop our standards. So in China, you're looking at about 6 microwatts per centimeter squared. Russia has about 10. Italy has a target of 10. And in the U.S., we're still at about 1,000 for cell phone frequency.
Okay, do you use a cell phone, Cindy? How do you use it?
No, I don't. I think you ought to have a cell phone and think about it maybe like a AAA card. If you break down, great. Call for help.
Yeah. It's become a crutch, hasn't it?
Yeah. Well, when we go, around and testify in public hearings about whether or not a new cell site ought to be approved, and the industry comes in and says, well, they make everyone safe because you can always report a freeway accident. Isn't it interesting that using a cell phone while you're driving creates a collision rate that's 400%? It's equivalent to drunk driving. So these things are creating the accidents, but then you use the cell phone to report. Come on.
Well, that's true. I mean, I have seen people, I've seen women put makeup on when they're driving. Well,
there are a lot of things that distract, but when you consider that putting a phone to your head changes the brainwave activity in your brain for a period of time, and it creates a visual impairment because your brain can't do 2 visual tasks as well at once. Putting on lipstick is a pale comparison, or eating, or having a conversation with someone in your car. None of these have the potential to change the way that your brain functions and to impair it for a period of time. So we're really talking about the kind of influence, during a driving task that probably shouldn't exist at all. And one of the things we're going to look for in these states that have the hands-free laws coming into effect is whether or not the collision rate is affected, is reduced in comparison to, having a handheld. Most people think if you have a handheld, you're fiddling with it, you're distracted, you have, the accident rate goes up. But wouldn't it be interesting if when you're using a hands-free model with a Bluetooth or a wireless, we're still seeing the memory impairment or the mental impairment, the visual impairment occurring? It would actually be a great way to demonstrate it's the radio frequency.
Are you seeing people just zoned out, Cindy?
What we're seeing is people who have lost the ability to have a linear thought, to multitask, to have the kind of memory that allows you to remember in the short term what you have done and what you intend to do next.
Unbelievable. It really is tragic, isn't it?
Well, one of the things that we do a lot is sit in meetings with lots of high-powered people that are all using phones and BlackBerries. Some of them carry 2 and 3 devices, all the time. And if you look at people who have become accustomed, in fact, dependent on this kind of, wireless lifestyle and input, you begin to see that it almost looks to be an addictive kind of a behavior for them.
All right, stay with us, Cindy. We're going to be back with you in just a moment, and then next hour we'll open up the phone lines. People can ask you a question or two. I'm George Noory. This is Coast to Coast Day.